One woman was institutionalized after publicly calling the clergyman she said had refused to pay her a liar and a hypocrite. Another was committed by her own half-brother under a false identity, one that removed her family name and listed her parents as unknown. And a third entered an asylum after saying she believed someone was poisoning her, only to spend 26 months writing secret appeals with a pencil barely an inch long and hiding the pages inside her skirt. Their stories unfolded in different countries and under different laws, but each woman discovered the same terrifying truth. Once an institution controlled the official record, almost anything she said could be dismissed as another symptom of insanity. Welcome to this podcast episode of Her Strange Hour. I'm Ivy Monroe, and let's dig right in. In September of 1837, Mary Frances Heaton was 37 years old and living in Doncaster, England. Mary had once belonged to a financially comfortable family, but her father's bankruptcy changed the direction of her life. She eventually earned her own living as a music teacher, working first in London and then in Doncaster. Among her pupils was the daughter of the Reverend John Sharp. According to Mary, Reverend Sharp had failed to pay her for music lessons she had given his daughter twice a week during 1834 and 1835. Mary wanted the disagreement submitted to arbitration so that someone could examine her claim and settle the debt. But no settlement came. Eventually, Mary stopped asking quietly. During a public confrontation connected to a church service, she accused Reverend Sharp of dishonesty. She called him a whited sepulchre, a thief, a villain, a liar, and a hypocrite. Mary's words were definitely confrontational. But what followed was far more serious than a public argument. She was arrested, taken to Doncaster jail, and brought before local magistrates. By the following day, she had been declared a lunatic, insane, and a dangerous idiot. She was then transferred to the West Riding Pauper Lunatic Asylum in Wakefield. Mary had challenged a man she believed owed her money. For that, she would lose the next 41 years of her life. When I sit and think about how little rights women had, to basically lose her rights because she had been wronged, it's so mind-boggling. Once inside the asylum, Mary's anger became part of the evidence against her. This was a time when women really couldn't show emotions or frustrations like their male counterparts. Her medical notes described her as wild, flighty, excited, and irritable. Later entries called her abusive and violent, and recorded that she struck other patients. Those descriptions should not simply be ignored. Mary may have experienced serious mental distress, especially as the years of confinement continued. I can only imagine that anyone locked away that long when they shouldn't be would eventually go crazy. But the records also reveal how quickly her behavior was interpreted through the narrowest possible lens. If she protested, that could be called excitement. If she became angry, that could be called violence. If she continued insisting that she had been wronged, the persistence of that complaint could itself be treated as evidence that she was irrational. The institution also searched for explanations inside Mary's body. In 1839, her records noted that she had not menstruated for 6 years. Doctors at the time apparently considered this relevant to her mental condition. Their prescribed treatment was to pass electrical shocks through her pelvis every second day. The surviving notes do not explain how long this treatment continued or what effect it had. Mary did not immediately surrender to institutional life. In 1843, 6 years after her admission, she escaped. She was captured and returned to the asylum. Her file records that she vowed she would escape again, although no evidence survives that she ever managed a second attempt. As the years passed, Mary found another way to resist. She began to sew. At first glance, the surviving pieces resembled traditional embroidered samplers. They contain carefully arranged words, shields, flowers, numbers, and decorative borders. But these were not ordinary needlework exercises. Mary filled the cloth with names, dates, financial amounts, accusations, religious references, and fragments of her life. She stitched about the money she believed she was owed. She recorded details about people connected to her past. She included references to the asylum and the treatment she believed she had suffered. Some portions are recognizable and connected to documented people or events. Other passages are fragmented, difficult to interpret, or connected to beliefs that cannot be verified. Mary sometimes referred to herself as Mrs. Seymour. One sampler included references to Lord John Seymour and suggested that a nobleman had once admired her. Another was created as a petition to Queen Victoria, asking the Queen to place her royal seal upon Mary's work. It would be misleading to describe every word as a factual record. Mary's embroidery appears to contain memory, accusation, symbolism, possible delusion, and personal mythology, all stitched together. But that does not make the samplers meaningless. The Asylum produced one version of Mary Frances Heaton. That version described her behavior, diagnosed her condition, and documented the ways she failed to conform. Mary produced another version. Her record named people. It preserved dates. It recorded money. It accused those she believed had wronged her. And unlike the institution's case notes, it allowed Mary to decide what mattered. The embroidery also shows extraordinary patience. Every letter had to be planned. Every line required time. Every name was stitched slowly into cloth by a woman who had no idea whether anyone outside the institution would ever see it. Mary remained at the West Riding Asylum until 1873, when she was transferred to the South Yorkshire Asylum. She died there in 1878. She was never permanently released. The official record preserved Mary as a patient. Her samplers preserved her as a teacher, an artist, an accuser, and a woman who refused to allow the institution to have the final word. Mary Frances Heaton used thread to protect the identity the asylum had rewritten. Now we move to France, and we will discover that another woman would spend 14 years fighting for something even more basic, the right to use her own name. On September 8, 1854, an unfamiliar man arrived at Hersilie Rouy's home in Paris. Hersilie was 40 years old. She was an accomplished pianist and music teacher who had established a recognizable identity within Parisian musical life. The stranger who appeared at her door was well-dressed and decorated. Another man waited in the entrance hall. According to the memoir Hersilie later left behind, the visitor claimed that he had been sent by her half-brother, Claude Daniel Rouy. He told Hersilie that her brother wanted a reconciliation. He said that Claude Daniel had heard she was unwell and was inviting her to spend several days at a country home. A carriage was already waiting outside. Hersilie refused. She told the stranger that she did not leave with unfamiliar men, and that her brother could write to her or send one of his sons. The visitor then identified himself as Baron de Kinkelin and told Hersilie that if she would not follow him willingly, she would be taken by force. Hersilie understood how dangerous the situation had become. She later wrote that she tried not to shout or create a scene, because any visible panic could immediately be used as evidence that she was insane. She had only enough time to grab an old hat, wrap herself in a shawl, and pick up a small basket containing important papers. She also carried her little dog under one arm. Hersilie was taken to the asylum at Charenton, but she was not entered into its records simply as Hersilie Rouy. She was registered as Joséphine Chevalier, the daughter of unknown parents. This needs some explanation. Joséphine was connected to Hersilie's own given names, and Chevalier was her mother's family name. The identity was therefore not invented from nothing. Instead, pieces of Hersilie's real identity were rearranged and stripped of the connections that could establish who she was. The name Rouy was missing, Her known family was missing. Her social position was missing. Her professional history was missing. Her parents were recorded as unknown. On paper, the established musician Hersilie Rouy had been transformed into a woman of uncertain identity with no recognized family and few resources. Her half-brother was connected to the arrangement. He later continued making payments toward the care of the woman recorded as Miss Chevalier, while presenting himself as her benefactor. Hersilie was soon moved from Charenton to the Salpêtrière. Over the next 14 years, she passed through 5 different institutions. Wherever she went, she repeated the same central claim. She was Hersilie Rouy. She had a family. She had civil and religious records that could establish her identity. She was not an unknown woman named Joséphine Chevalier. But once Hersilie had been classified as mentally ill, her insistence could be interpreted as part of the illness. Her case was not as simple as a completely rational woman being imprisoned for no reason. Hersilie expressed unusual and sometimes grandiose beliefs. Her writings included complicated theories about family secrets, political intrigue, hidden identities, and royal connections. Doctors who examined her believed that she experienced genuine delusions. But that is what makes her case so disturbing. A woman could be wrong about some things and still be telling the truth about others. Hersilie may have experienced delusions. She was also telling the truth when she said her name was Hersilie Rouy. She was telling the truth when she said that her parents were not unknown. And she was telling the truth when she said documents existed that could prove it. But her more extraordinary beliefs made it easier for officials to dismiss everything she said at once. Every time Hersilie repeated her name, the institution could point to the register. The register said Joséphine Chevalier. Every time she described her family, the register said her parents were unknown. The official paperwork appeared to prove that the woman challenging it was confused. By 1863, Hersilie had been transferred to an institution in Orléans. There, her circumstances gradually began to change. People connected to the hospice, including E. Lenormand de Varenne and his wife, took an interest in her case. They allowed Hersilie more social contact and observed how she behaved outside the strict routine of the ward. They also began looking for evidence. Family records, civil documents, and correspondence were gathered. These papers supported the identity Hersilie had been claiming for years. In 1867, a doctor at Orléans wrote about a patient officially registered as Joséphine Chevalier, who was, in reality, Hersilie Rouy. The discovery created a problem much larger than one woman's name. For more than a decade, Hersilie had been moved between institutions as a woman of unknown parentage. Yet officials now had evidence that her identity was exactly what she had repeatedly said it was. Her complaints could no longer be dismissed as easily. The efforts to secure her release continued through 1868. Then, on November 14th, after approximately 14 years of confinement, Hersilie finally left the hospital in Orléans. The surviving account records the transition in a striking way. She left the institution under the name Joséphine Chevalier. 3 days later, she entered a hotel under the name Hersilie Rouy. The name had never truly stopped belonging to her, but it had taken 14 years, multiple institutions, and the intervention of people willing to investigate before the official world recognized it again. Freedom did not restore the life Hersilie had lost. Her musical career had disappeared. Her possessions had reportedly been searched, removed, or sold. Friends and relatives had been told conflicting stories about what had happened to her, and Hersilie claimed that some had even been led to believe she was dead. She spent years petitioning authorities and demanding an investigation into her confinement. Her case eventually attracted public and political attention. In 1878, the French government awarded her compensation and a continuing pension connected to the abuses surrounding her institutionalization. Hersilie died in 1881. 2 years later, her writings were published as Mémoires d'une aliénée, Memoirs of a Madwoman, with the involvement of Lenormand de Varenne. The title accepted the label that had been placed upon her, The pages challenged everything officials believed that label allowed them to ignore. Hersilie's identity survived because someone finally stopped asking whether she sounded unusual and began asking whether the documents supported what she was saying. However, for our final story, Clarissa Caldwell Lathrop, she could not depend on anyone inside her institution to conduct the kind of investigation she needed. So she began building her case in secret, with scraps of paper and a pencil only an inch long. For more than a decade, Hersilie had been moved between institutions as a woman of unknown parentage. Yet officials now had evidence that her identity was exactly what she had repeatedly said it was. Her complaints could no longer be dismissed as easily. The efforts to secure her release continued through 1868. Then, on November 14th, after approximately 14 years of confinement, Hersilie finally left the hospital in Orléans. The surviving account records the transition in a striking way. She left the institution under the name Joséphine Chevalier. 3 days later, she entered a hotel under the name Hersilie Rouy. The name had never truly stopped belonging to her, but it had taken 14 years, multiple institutions, and the intervention of people willing to investigate before the official world recognized it again. Freedom did not restore the life Hersilie had lost. Her musical career had disappeared. Her possessions had reportedly been searched, removed, or sold. Friends and relatives had been told conflicting stories about what had happened to her, and Hersilie claimed that some had even been led to believe she was dead. She spent years petitioning authorities and demanding an investigation into her confinement. Her case eventually attracted public and political attention. In 1878, the French government awarded her compensation and a continuing pension connected to the abuses surrounding her institutionalization. Hersilie died in 1881. 2 years later, her writings were published as Mémoires d'une aliénée, Memoirs of a Madwoman, with the involvement of Lenormand de Varenne. The title accepted the label that had been placed upon her. The pages challenged everything officials believed that label allowed them to ignore. Hersilie's identity survived because someone finally stopped asking whether she sounded unusual and began asking whether the documents supported what she was saying. However, for our final story, Clarissa Caldwell Lathrop, she could not depend on anyone inside her institution to conduct the kind of investigation she needed. So she began building her case in secret, with scraps of paper and a pencil only an inch long. In 1880, Clarissa Caldwell Lathrop was living in Rochester, New York. She was educated, unmarried, and had worked as a teacher. She had also become convinced that people around her were trying to poison or drug her. Clarissa connected unusual physical symptoms, strange odors, food, medicine, and the behavior of people she knew into a larger theory of persecution. Her relatives believed these suspicions were delusions. Clarissa insisted that they were possibilities she wanted properly investigated. There is no reliable independent evidence proving that anyone was poisoning Clarissa. Her claims must remain exactly that, her claims. But whether the poisoning was real and whether she should have lost control of her life were two separate questions. According to the account Clarissa later published, she believed she was traveling to the Utica State Lunatic Asylum to consult its superintendent, Dr. John P. Gray. Instead, when she arrived on October 19, 1880, she was confined as a patient. Clarissa later described the asylum as a living tomb. She said that once she entered, she felt as though she had been erased from the outside world. Letters could be read, delayed, or prevented from leaving. Her complaints were treated as evidence of her condition. 1 month after her arrival, on November 19th, Clarissa sat near a window, watching the season's first snowfall. She found a small piece of wrapping paper. Another patient gave her a pencil that was only about an inch long. To Clarissa, it was a treasure. She used it first to write a poem. Then she began recording her experiences and preparing arguments for her release. One document was titled Claims to Sanity. Clarissa made an important distinction in it. She described the poisoning as supposititious, something suspected, not something she claimed had been conclusively proven. Her argument was that, considering the possibility of poisoning and trying to investigate it did not automatically make her insane. But writing inside the asylum was dangerous. Clarissa later claimed that after visiting another patient's room, she lost consciousness under circumstances she interpreted as being drugged or anesthetized. When she awoke, her papers were missing. So was the tiny pencil. Again, we cannot establish that someone inside the asylum drugged Clarissa and stole her writing. That was her interpretation of what happened. What is documented in her own account is what she did next. She found another pencil, also about an inch long. Then she modified her clothing. Clarissa sewed a hidden pocket near the bottom of her skirt. She concealed the pencil inside the band of the skirt and wrote her letters along the narrow edges of old newspapers, because she often had nothing else to use. The scraps went into the secret pocket. Whenever Clarissa sat down, she carefully positioned herself over it so that no one could reach the papers without her knowing. She kept her door open and tried to behave as though she had nothing to hide. Before the ward doors were unlocked in the morning, she rose at the first light of dawn and wrote as quickly as she could. The institution had control of the regular mail. Clarissa tried to create another path to the outside world. Eventually, she managed to contact James Bailey Silkman. Silkman had his own history with institutional confinement. After regaining his freedom, he became interested in assisting people who claimed they were being wrongfully detained. For Clarissa, he represented something she had been unable to find for more than 2 years. A person outside the asylum, willing to treat her words as information instead of symptoms. 2 days before Thanksgiving in 1882, Clarissa had been confined for 26 months. She was sitting in her room, knitting a white shawl, when a doctor appeared at the door. He told her that a man had arrived claiming to be her lawyer. Clarissa tried to hide her excitement. She followed the doctor into another room and found a tall, thin man with gray hair waiting for her. He introduced himself as James Silkman. Her messages had reached someone. Silkman obtained a writ of habeas corpus and personally served it upon Dr. Gray. The writ required the institution to produce Clarissa before a judge, rather than simply continuing to hold her behind its own authority. Clarissa then waited approximately 10 days, unsure whether the legal order would truly free her. While searching through old newspapers, she discovered a tiny report in the Brooklyn Eagle. The notice stated that a writ had been served and that she was expected to appear before Judge George Barnard. It was only a few lines in small print, but it was proof that her case now existed outside the asylum. At her first appearance, Judge Barnard said he saw no signs of insanity in Clarissa. He temporarily sent her to the Hudson River State Hospital for observation, allowing time for her relatives to appear and challenge her release. 10 days later, she returned to court. Clarissa did not pretend that she had never suspected poisoning. She openly discussed the beliefs that had been used against her. She said her suspicions had never been absolute, and that she remained open to evidence that could prove her wrong. After hearing her and questioning the people opposing her release, Judge Barnard said he saw no cause to detain her. He found her capable of caring for herself. Clarissa was discharged. After 26 months, she walked away from the court with her freedom, but almost nothing else. She had no money. Silkman gave her $5, and Clarissa placed it inside an envelope because she did not even have a purse. In 1890, she published her account under the title, A Secret Institution. The private scraps she once hid beneath her skirt became a book the institution could no longer intercept. Clarissa also became involved in efforts to reform laws governing commitment and to assist other people who believed they had been wrongfully institutionalized. Her release did not prove that someone had poisoned her. It did not prove that every suspicion she described was accurate. It proved that unusual beliefs did not automatically give an institution the right to hold her forever without meaningful outside review. Mary Frances Heaton stitched her accusations into cloth. Hersilie Rouy fought through identity papers and family records. Clarissa Caldwell Lathrop wrote along the margins of discarded newspapers and hid the pieces inside her clothing. None of their stories requires us to pretend that they never behaved unusually, never struggled mentally, or never believed things that could not be proven. The more disturbing truth is that once each woman had been labeled insane, even the facts she got right became easier to ignore. Mary's unpaid lessons disappeared beneath descriptions of her anger. Hersilie's real identity disappeared beneath an altered name. Clarissa's right to question her confinement disappeared beneath the question of whether someone had poisoned her. The institutions created the official records, but Mary, Hersilie, and Clarissa each created a record of her own. And that is why, more than a century later, we can still hear them. And that is the strange and unsettling story of Mary Frances Heaton, Hersilie Rouy, and Clarissa Caldwell Lathrop. 3 women whose voices survived, even after institutions tried to hide the truth. Which of these stories would you like to discuss the most? Let me know in the comments. And if you enjoy strange history, forgotten women, and unsolved stories, subscribe to Her Strange Hour so you don't miss the next episode. I'm Ivy Monroe, and I'll see you soon.